We're going to take a look at the question of whether Barabbas' first name was Jesus. Course, right up front, being a Byzantine prioritist, I'm not going to roll with Jesus as the first name of Barabbas, because I think when you take the external evidence and you compare that with the internal evidence, I don't think you can come out suggesting that Barabbas' first name is Jesus. But again, anyway, lots of interesting stuff to look at. And this is it right here. So this is Matthew chapter 27. Specifically, I want to focus on verse 15 and 16. Now, at the feast, the governor was accustomed to releasing to the multitude one prisoner whom they wished. So they're releasing a prisoner, whoever the crowd wants to release. And at that time, they had a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. Barabbas. Now, the interesting question here is it just simply Barabbas, or is it Jesus Barabbas? And of course, we got a little footnote here. This is the New King James Version. Now, this is going to be one of those few times where I actually don't like how the New King James Version has footnoted this. Okay, so they footnoted this by suggesting that the Nestle-Aland text says Jesus Barabbas. And that's kind of only half the story. Because when you look at the Nestle-Aland text, what's actually happening is they have Jesus Barabbas, but they put Jesus in square brackets, indicating that there's, a significant amount of doubt amongst those on the NA committee. So you don't see that detail in the New King James Version. Let's take a look at a couple other versions to see what they're saying as well. So the English Standard Version says, and they had then a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. Now, again, what's interesting here is the ESV doesn't feel the need to add any footnote to let anyone know. Now, where it gets interesting now is when you pop over to the New International Version. This is the 2011 edition. This is where it starts getting a little different. Now, it was the governor's custom at the festival to release a prisoner chosen to the crowd. At that time, they had a well-known prisoner whose name was Jesus Barabbas. Jesus Barabbas. So when the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked them, which one do you want me to release to you? Jesus Barabbas, or Jesus who is called the Christ? The NIV decided to go with the less attested reading. And to be honest, that's like no surprise, okay? That's no surprise for the NIV, because they went with the really strange reading in Mark 1:41, I think it is, where rather than Jesus being filled with compassion, he was filled with anger. And of course, that reading being filled with anger in the Greek tradition only has one manuscript, and that's Codex D, and that's the really like weird, obscure, the manuscript filled with weird, obscure readings. So it's surprising that they would base it off the one. And I think they went to Latin and a few other things, but just the whole Greek tradition, it is essentially saying that it's Jesus was filled with compassion at Mark 1:41. Anyway, so with that being said, it's just no surprise that the NIV has gone with Jesus here. But what's more interesting is it really isn't the only one. So this is the New English Translation, and of course, we all love the New English Translation for the notes. I have not run into a person, actually, who likes the New English Translation itself, but everybody I talk to always prefers the notes in the New English Translation. So verse 16, at that time, they had in custody a notorious prisoner named Jesus Barabbas. So after they had assembled, Pilate said to them, whom do you want me to release for you, Jesus Barabbas, or Jesus who is called Christ? And of course, when you take a look at the footnote here, we'll just kind of go through this really briefly. It says, although the external evidence for the inclusion of Jesus before Barabbas in 16 and 17 is rather sparse. Now, see that's an admission here that the external evidence is not really all that great. So being restricted virtually to manuscripts of what was formerly labeled the Caesarean text. So Theta, F1, 700, the Syriac, Armenian, there's a couple, Georgian and Origen. He has a manuscript where he suggests that Jesus, well, I shouldn't say he suggests. He is aware that there is a discrepancy there. But if I'm not mistaken here, Origen's suggestion is that basically all the manuscripts that are around him don't have the name Jesus in there. And so, yeah, we'll go in there. Anyway, so the omission of the Lord's name in apposition to Barabbas, apposition is just a fancy word for saying they're together, a little more than that, but that's fine, is such a strongly motivated reading that it can hardly be original. So what they're doing is they're appealing to internal criteria here. It is strongly motivated reading that it can be hardly be original. So what is this strong motivation for removing the name of Jesus? So according to a number of scholars, there's the potential here, right, that a scribe may have seen the name Jesus next to a notorious murderer named Barabbas and said, "Nuh-uh, I'm not going to put the name Jesus next to Barabbas. We're going to take that out because I just can't handle seeing the name of Jesus attached to a murderer." There's some silliness surrounding that mentality anyway, because Jesus died on the cross and took on the sins of the world. Anyway, there is no good explanation for a scribe unintentionally adding Isun before Barabbas, especially since Barabbas is mentioned first in each verse. Thus, ditography is ruled out. Further, the addition of ton legomenon, Christon, who is called Christ, to Isun in verse 17 makes better sense if Barabbas is also called Jesus. Otherwise, a mere Jesus would have been sufficient appellation to distinguish the two. But the problem here, so what they're saying is the fact that the phrase, "Shall I release to you Jesus Barabbas or Jesus who is called Christ?" The fact that the "who is called Christ" appellation, as they call it, is attached to Jesus in there. What they're suggesting is that the reason it's there is to make a distinction between Jesus Barabbas and Jesus the Christ. But this assumes that that's the motive of Pilate who's doing that. Now, we do have, I would say, a better motive to suggest that there's a better way to look at that. And that's the motive that Pilate, before he goes on to release him to the crowd, says to them, he hasn't done anything. I find no fault in the man. Just take that into consideration when you make your decision, right? So Pilate thinks he's innocent. And you can see within the context here that it's not that he's making a distinction between Barabbas and Jesus, but he's appealing to the Jewish crowd who's crying out, "Crucify him." He's appealing to them saying, "Guys, this is your own Messiah. This is your Christ. This is your anointed one. He came for you guys." You can see the sense in which he's saying, like, this is your important. That becomes an interpretation, which I think is far more reasonable than Pilate just merely trying to make a distinguishing between the two. So he goes to note, Metzger notes that Codex S, a 10th century majuscule, along with a score of minuscules, have a marginal comment on this verse as follows. "In many ancient copies which I have met with, I found Barabbas himself likewise called Jesus. The attribution of the scholium is variously given as Anastasius, Chrysostom, or even Origen." So that's the NET's note on there. Again, this comes down to how much, like if you go back up into this note, do the scribes not like seeing the name Jesus attached to Barabbas? And when you compare the external evidence and all the manuscripts that have Jesus Barabbas in there, which is like hardly any, almost none, and the Latin versions don't have it. Hardly any of the other versions have it. It's hard to believe that if Jesus was original, that it would have been erased from pretty much the entire record. If that's the case, then what do we say about preservation, right? We're just kind of like basing this off of an assumption where, maybe we think that a scribe is upset at seeing the name Jesus next to Barabbas. So that's the NET. Let's pop over. We'll take a look at Metzger and see what he's saying. So here it is, 2716, 2717. We've got Isun in brackets and Isun ton in brackets. The tone is there because, let's be real, Vaticanus. All right. So Isun Varavan, Isun ton Varavan. So the reading preserved today in several witnesses of the Caesarean text was known to Origen. Again, this is a Caesarean reading. Now, the Caesarean text type, it is pretty much rejected for the most part. Some will still hold on to it, but for the most part, the Caesarean text is rejected, as in there's no such thing. But there are readings amongst the Caesarean manuscripts that do tend to group together. The text was known to Origen, who declares in his commentary on the passage, "In many copies it is not stated that Barabbas was also called Jesus, and perhaps the omission is right." So you can see here Origen suggesting that the name probably should be omitted. Now it says, Origen discloses in what follows his reason for disapproving of the reading Jesus Barabbas. Now, this is where it gets a little bit funny. "It cannot be right," he implies, "because in the whole range of the scriptures, we know that no one who is a sinner is called Jesus." So maybe there is something to the idea that scribe expunged it because he didn't like it being attached to Barabbas. Of course, I don't think the external evidence bears that out. Anyway, so in a 10th century unsealed manuscript, Codex S, we would have taken a look at it, but Codex S, it's just kind of like ugly, black and white, hard to see. So I didn't think it would be beneficial to look at that. But yeah, we've got Codex Theta, 038 at the top, and Codex Vaticanus. We'll take a look at those. But yeah, and in about 20 minuscule manuscripts, a marginal comment states, in many ancient copies which I have met with, I found Barabbas himself likewise called Jesus. That is, the question of Pilate stood there as follows. Tina thalete apoton dio apoliso imin, isun ton varavan, ison ton legomenon Christon. For apparently the paternal name of the robber was Barabbas. So what he's suggesting here is this note suggests that the name Barabbas was a last name, which is interpreted son of the teacher. This scholium, which is usually assigned in the manuscripts either to Anastasius, bishop of Antioch, perhaps latter part of the 6th century, or to Chrysostom, is in one manuscript attributed to Origen, who may indeed be its ultimate source. So they're suggesting here, whereas the NET kind of gave all three, the notes in the NET gave all three as possible. The UBS committee, they seem to think that it was likely from Origen, which puts that, of course, into the 3rd century. So in verse 17, the word isun could have been accidentally added or deleted by transcribers owing to the presence of himin before it. And this is where it gets really interesting, because you can see where there would be a duplicate of the iota and the nu right there. And so if you just kind of duplicate that, then, whether you think you've done it or you went back or there's some sort of haplography going on there or something like that, you could see a potential where someone might accidentally put in a iota nu and then see that as the name Jesus before Barabbas. So furthermore, the reading of B 1010 ton varavan, so that's the article before Barabbas, appears to presuppose in an ancestor the presence of isun. Now, again, I would question that. And the reason why I would question that is because when it's referring to ton varavan, that's the textual variant that is in verse 17. So the reason why this is maybe not the case is because there is the anaphoric use of the article. So the word ton doesn't necessarily have to come from Jesus ton varavan, but the ton could simply be there because it's anaphoric use to Barabbas in verse 16. Grammatically, that works out. I mean, there's no problem with that. To presuppose that it's the ancestor presence of isun, again, I think that's very speculative, and it's probably just as likely as those manuscripts that contain ton could be using that anaphorically. Anyway, it goes on to say, a majority of the committee was of the opinion that the original text of Matthew had the double name. So the majority of the committee are like, okay, good, double name, we're good, we're rolling with that. Has it in both verses, and that isun was deliberately suppressed. And this is the same sort of theory that was proffered by the New English Translation notes, that isun was deliberately suppressed in most witnesses for reverential considerations. That is, they didn't like the name Jesus being attached to a murderer. So in view of the relatively slender external support for isun, again, this is another admission that externally it doesn't have much support. Externally, isun should be left out because it wasn't originally penned by Matthew. However, in opposition to the external evidence, it was deemed fitting to enclose the word within square brackets. So why is it in square brackets? Well, as much as they are happy to include that in the text, there seems to be a little bit of doubt because of its sparse external support. So in the square brackets, it goes. Now we're going to take a look at manuscript GA38. So you can see right here, isun varavan, isun ton legomenon, isun. Yeah, it's hard to read. So what's interesting about this manuscript, right? This is Theta. It's a 9th century manuscript. Is one, right? The big one here is, of course, Jesus is in there. Jesus Barabbas. But what's interesting is if you look here, right? You have Jesus Barabbas, or Jesus, the one being called Christ. Jesus is got the nomina sacra form here, but so does Jesus on Barabbas. Jesus on Barabbas also has the the nomina sacra form. Now I was to the understanding that nomina sacra was used specifically for like those spiritual things, right? You have it for Father, you have it for the name Jesus, you have it for the name Christ, you have it for Jerusalem, you have it for Israel. You have nomina sacra for a number of things related to a lot of these theological, these theologically dense words. But I'm surprised to see the nomina sacra used here for Barabbas, especially under the claim in which scribes just didn't want to see the name Jesus next to a notorious murderer. So that I don't know. I just found that rather interesting. So this is GA 38 Codex Theta, 9th century. It's a Caesarean manuscript. In fact, it's suggested that this is kind of like the representative for the Caesarean family of manuscripts. And so that would include F1, F13. Those are a couple family groups of manuscripts. And then there's manuscript 700. There's a lectionary manuscript in that family. And I think there's somewhere around 20-ish manuscripts in that family. But nonetheless, this is the head honcho for the Caesarean text. Now, Codex Vaticanus, you briefly saw that mentioned in the commentaries in the NET and in the in Metzger's commentary, and so you have it here. Polioso himin ton varavan isun ton legomenon. It's so much easier to read in Vaticanus, Christon. And so the interesting thing about Codex Vaticanus is right here. It's the article. Again, some are suggesting that the article here, that this is just kind of like a leftover vestige of a text critical consideration, because Vaticanus was probably copied from a manuscript. Now, this part's conjecture a little bit, okay? But Vaticanus was probably copied from a manuscript that had Isun in it, and so Isun got kicked out of this manuscript and then was left in the article there, and so that's why the article is there. Now, there's not many manuscripts that have the article. It's just a tiny handful. We'll go over Dirk Jonken's article because he breaks it down a little bit more. But let me see if I can find it. But this would be a reference to Barabbas being mentioned here. So in verse 16, Desmion epis imon legomenon varavan. Sin higmenon. So varavan right there. So just a few lines up. That's what the tone, right? The article is referring to. So anaphorically, it could very well be. So whether it's a text critical consideration that's causing that problem, or whether it's just a grammatical leftover thing, could very well be. Of course, if you're a text critical text scholar, you may find yourself with that presupposing that idea that this is maybe a textual reason for it being here rather than a grammatical issue being there. So there's that going on as well. Yeah, so that's just a brief look at two of the manuscripts in which are related to this issue with Barabbas.